What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to go back to the bench and we're going to talk about soldering. Super important. I'm going to give you 5 things that you've heard about this that you should basically ignore, never believe, and forget what the internet told you. And then I'm going to give you a couple of tips to help you be better at soldering and to be more successful at your guitar projects. So first of all, there is a couple of things that we need to, before we get over to the bench, that we need to lay out about this. Number one, first of all, before all you people from not where I live jump in, this is the most important thing, pronunciation. So it is spelled S-O-L-D-E-R-I-N-G. In America, where I was born and where I was taught the English language, American English and Canadian English, because I'm actually from the border, it's pronounced soldering. If you have a problem with that, you can go somewhere else and complain about it. I don't care, okay? It's kind of like metric and standard. I understand the difference, but I just use it how I feel like using it. So we got the pronunciation thing out of the way. Next, let's discuss what it actually is and what it is not. This is the first in our kind of myths that you need to basically ignore. A lot of folks think that soldering is welding, and it's not. Welding is actually where you take 2 pieces of metal and you actually melt them together. You're heating up both of them so hot that they'll actually melt together and become one. Now, obviously, that doesn't happen 100%, and there can be weakness on either side of the joint. You could get into welding science, that's a whole nother thing. But the basic action is that you're taking 2 pieces of metal and you're welding them together. Even in something like MIG welding or TIG welding, where you're actually introducing a third party, being the welding rod or the welding wire, all that's doing is really, there's 2 things. It's acting as an electrode, and it's creating a high amount of heat in the middle so that the 2 pieces can come together and be melted together. Soldering is not that, okay? Soldering and brazing are where you take a completely third-party thing, and brazing, it's brass, bronze. There's brass, bronze, copper. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. But in electronic soldering, it's a mixture of lead and tin. So, you know, our normal solder wire that we have right here. It's a mixture of lead and tin. We'll get into lead-free later. But when we solder, we're not actually melting anything together. The 2 items are not becoming one. What we're doing here is we're actually creating a chemical reaction whereby the solder actually travels into, on a molecular level really, into the adjoining pieces. So it's actually bonding them. It is not welding them. That's important once we start to understand some of these other myths. Okay, let's get over to the bench to get into the rest of these, because I want to kind of show you some up-close stuff. All right, the next myth or whatever that you need to kind of pretty much ignore, don't even worry about it, is that there is more conductive solder for more tones in guitar stuff. You'll hear people talking about using silver solder because it's more conductive, so more tones. You'll hear people talking about 6337 solder. This is, and what they're talking about is 60-40. So this 60-40, 6337. So what this is it's the ratio between lead and tin that is in common solder. And so this is 60-40 Kester solder. I'll leave a link to everything we're talking about in the description today. This is the right stuff. This is the stuff that I use every day. Now, this costs like $40 because it's a pound, but there's also little smaller containers that you can get for the hobbyist. You might not use as much, obviously, as much as I do every day. So there's smaller things. So it's not expensive to buy. It just happens that I buy a lot at a time. So this is 60-40. So 60% tin, 40% lead. Now here's the thing. 6337 and silver solder. There's a bunch of other mixtures that folks say is way more conductive and, you know, super fancy, and there's tone fairies and junk in there. All that is it's actually has nothing to do with the tone, has nothing to do with conductivity. It has to do with melting point. And so when you're doing very specific types of soldering with very specific types of components where heat is really important, microcontrollers and such like that, then you're really more worried about soldering at various heats. So for example, actually I just have this laying right here. This is a microcontroller for one of my my pickup winders. So when we're doing this, this is all surface soldered, and they do this by wave soldering. It's a completely different process. And so they might use a different percentage of solder because they need a different liquid and temperature settings to solder something like this. Guitar soldering is basically the caveman of soldering. It's like the easiest, it's the dumbest kind. So 60-40, rosin core, we'll get into that in a minute. No big deal, basic stuff. Just use basic solder, but use quality solder because it will cooperate more easily. Side note to that, some countries have banned the use of lead in solder, and so there is lead-free solder. When we do big orders for stuff that goes to Europe and there's various other places we have to use it, I absolutely hate it. You have to use a separate soldering iron so that you don't cross-contaminate in case they do ROHS compliance testing. It is a whole pain in the butt. I absolutely hate it, but you have to do it because you have to do it because of regulations. But if you can avoid using lead-free solder at all costs, that would be amazing. Myth number 3, that you have to have some sort of mechanical bond that is beyond the solder joint. So what people are talking about when they talk about this is they'll take a piece of wire, they'll stick it through the pot like so, and then they'll be like, you have to bend it over, right? So we bend it over like this, bend it over itself, because the chemical bond of solder is not very strong, and if you don't do that, it's gonna come apart. Total baloney. And what this does is this just makes servicing the guitar absolutely a pain in the butt in the future. So if you have to replace a pot, if you have to replace a jack at a gig, etc., you know, we're talking an absolute pain in the butt to deal with. And there's no advantage in doing this. Let me show you something here. Let's take this real quick. Let's just do this. I've been meaning to demonstrate this in a video anyway. Let's go ahead and not do that. And we're going to do it the way I do it. Like a normal human being and not some kind of savage. And we're just going to, in fact, so we don't bias this, let's give this a new end. Apparently I knew new wire clippers. So no mechanical bond. We're just going to stick it in the hole. We're gonna make sure that it's a good solder joint. We're gonna let it cool. Okay. We're gonna try to pull it out. I broke the wire. The solder joint didn't break, the wire broke. It actually stretched the wire out. It broke the wire, okay? When I've done tests like this before, I've actually broken the pot. But the solder joint, absolutely perfect integrity, literally stretched the copper center out of the tinning and broke the wire. And you saw how hard I had to pull that, wrap it around my hand. So that is absolute baloney. All right, myth number 4 that you should basically totally avoid is do not use any kind of external flux in your soldering. People want to use, that flux is for plumbers, okay? If you use the correct kind of solder, no, we're not saying don't use flux, but don't use any external type of flux. You see how this says rosin right here? There's a rosin core inside this solder. So basically, you don't have to use flux. Everybody wants to use flux. So stupid. Anyways, that's for pipes, okay? That's for pipes. I'm gonna this is a silicone mat, so it won't burn. So what we're gonna do is we're going to just solder a bunch. I'm just gonna goop a bunch of solder. We're just gonna spread it around on here. And if you see, so you can kind of isolate it. See how the ball of solder is happening? But see all that slop that's happening around it? Watch this. Let me keep going here. Basically what I'm doing is, obviously that's not going to stick to the silicone because it's not going to solder to it. But what's happening is the flux that's inside there, the rosin, okay, is coming out. Okay, so what we have now is we have a ball of solder, and you see all this? That is all, in fact, you can, once it cools, you can scrape it all up, get rid of the lead and tin, but that right there, all that goop is rosin, and what that is that is a type of acid kind of mixed with tree, it's basically tree sap, more or less. It's the same stuff you put on a bow. And the acidic nature of it is what cleans the item that you are soldering. But it does it as you're soldering, and it does it with heat. This is very important that this all happens at the same time. Now here's the thing, you saw how much solder you'd never use that much solder to solder a component. That's way too much. The lack of mess here, because there's hardly any rosin, just enough to get the job done, to clean out the joint, and then it basically just kind of goes away, is enough. If you use external rosin, like that paste stuff that you're supposed to use on lead pipes, or copper pipes, it's just not reasonable. You're just going to make an unnecessary mess of your guitar. And if you're trying to make a neat soldering situation, this is the way to go. Rosin core solder. So that leads me to number 5. People want to say, I hear this all the time, that you're supposed to sand the back of the pot to clean it. Here's the problem with that. What you're actually trying to get rid of, okay, when you do that is obviously, oils and stuff. So like if it's greasy, it's probably not a good thing. If you get a pot in a bag, if you buy pots from our website, let's say you go to Dylan Talks Tone, you buy some of these 250K CTS pots, and you get them in the mail. They're going to come in a little plastic bag. You take them out. I can almost guarantee you, unless they were dropped in a vat of WD-40, that they're going to be fine, right? They're not greasy, they're not oily, they're clean, right? Except that we want to make sure that the surface is 100% clean. Now, if you were to take a file or a piece of sandpaper and file this, okay? So let's say you were to make this little rough spot right here. That does nothing. Here's why. Remember that we're doing this on a molecular level, right? This is smaller than you can see. This lead and tin mixture is going into the metal. Now you're gonna be like, well, yeah, but sand scratchers make it more, you can make it grippier and everything will be more awesome. Well, it doesn't matter because it's going at a much more microscopic level than that, number one. And number two, when you do this, you're not cleaning anything. All you're doing is you're pushing things around. A, because there's no solvent involved. B, you don't need to because you're not solving the actual problem. So the actual problem that you have with cleaning stuff is not usually solvents. Now sometimes it can be if it's a dirty part, but if it's a clean part that just comes out of a bag, what the problem that you're actually trying to fix is not solvents. What you're usually trying to fix is oxidation. So if you sand this, we've been talking here for a second, and by the time I go here to go to solder on top of it, there's still oxidation that needs to be removed because it happens immediately, right? Exposed metal oxidizes immediately. So now, remember, microscopic level here. So that's why we just go ahead and use enough heat. So 700 degrees Fahrenheit or so. See, I didn't even add any solder and we already have a solder joint there. Look at that. And we just add some solder. This has not been sanded in this spot. And what's happening is the solvent that is within the solder, that rosin that I just showed you, that acidic nature of that rosin is what is creating the solvent that we need to clean away the oxidation and therefore clean the spot. So it's happening without exposing it to further air, and therefore we have now a good base pad of solder to solder to. You don't need to sand anything. That is the dumbest thing, and it actually makes it worse. Okay, so after discussing a bunch of stuff you're not supposed to do, let me give you a couple of super constructive pointers for soldering. It's actually not that hard. We have a whole soldering course that I can link below that you can buy and go super in depth on each component, how to solder each component. It's pretty cool. It's not expensive, and it'll give you a pretty, thing. It'll give you a pretty comprehensive way to look at all this stuff. But even if you don't do that, no big deal. I'll show you the main tools that I use. This is my soldering iron. This is, what is this thing? This is a Heiko FX888D. This is about $130, something like that. So not every hobbyist is gonna wanna spend that much money on a soldering iron. But let me tell you what I love about this thing. First of all, it's really, really accurate, okay? Temperature-wise and etc. I would definitely recommend using, this is a 1/8 inch solder tip. Do not use a pointed one, because if you use a pointed one, heat transfer will not happen as efficiently. So if you use a spade tip or a screwdriver tip that is about an 1/8 inch, I don't like to go any bigger than that so that I can stay very precise. So when you're soldering stuff, I like the solder tip to be about the same size as an eyelet on, you know what I mean? Like that. So that's pretty cool. So I like the 1/8 inch solder tip. The reason I like this soldering iron is because it's like a smarty pants one. Basically, if you're soldering something super, super small, like a capacitor leg, it does not put a bunch of current into the soldering iron. But if you're gonna go on the back of a pot or like on the back of a pickup, for example, like when we're soldering pickup covers onto pickups, I have to use a lot. You don't wanna use more heat, but you want the thing to not lose heat. So when you're soldering, for example, a joint like this on the back of a pickup, the heat escapes into the object, right? So this will apply more current to maintain the temperature. So that's why I like this soldering iron, because it's smart enough to do that. Now, if you do not want to spend this much money, for $40 to $60, Weller makes a really good one. I'll leave a link to it in the description. It's the one I used for years and years on this bench before I got this one. I put it on 3.5, whatever the knob says, 3.5, that orange Weller one, and I used it for years. I had like 3 of them, not because they failed, but because I had one on each bench because they were so economical, and they are fantastic. So if you don't want to spend that much money, just get that orange Weller and it's awesome. I'll leave it in the link in the description. We talked about 6040 solder by Kester. I'll leave a link to this and the little hobby size ones so that you don't have to buy a pound of it. I think it's like 40 bucks or something at the time of making this video. The other thing that I like to buy, and I buy these in bulk so I can change them out, is this solder tip cleaner mesh. You notice I don't have a sponge. I do not like to use a wet sponge to clean my solder tip because it will corrode it very quickly. And here's why. What happens a lot of times is, let's say, because you really should, every time you solder a joint, you go in here and just give it a poke, and that cleans up the solder tip and gets you ready for the next one. But you really should also do this at the end of a soldering session. So a lot of times what will happen is you'll go like this, you'll put it in here, you'll shut your machine off, and you'll walk away. Now that will sit there, and if it's wet, it will corrode your solder tip over time. So because I use it so much, I don't like that. This stuff works a lot better. It keeps it cleaner, and it doesn't corrode your solder tip. And it's very cheap. You can buy, I don't know, they're like $6 or something on Amazon, and you get like a whole bag. It looks like a bag of steel wool. Don't use steel wool. Don't use steel wool, because that will damage your soldering stuff, and it will also put little fine fibers of steel into your work, and that will not be good. So do not use steel wool. The other thing I use is this very simple solder extractor. We discussed earlier, the smoke that you see when you solder is not lead. It's actually the rosin, but the rosin does have an acidic quality to it, so you don't want to be breathing it all day. And since I do this all day, this is all you really need. It's awesome. It sits here on the desk. It's got a cord on it, so I can pull it out close to my work. So usually when I'm sitting here working, I don't do it in videos because it's too noisy, but if I'm sitting here working and I've got work sitting here, then this fan is going like so. And if we turn this on and we hit some solder real quick just to show you how effective this is, solder smoke just goes straight into it, and that is a charcoal filter. And every week or so I just pull this filter out, and I take it and I smack it against the porch outside or whatever, and the dust comes out of it, and you bring it back in. You gotta, replace it every few months or something, but again, this is all day every day, so my use case is a lot heavier. The other thing that's important to soldering is keeping your work still. Chris at Texas Toast Guitars made me a bunch of these. All it is a piece of MDF with I think a 1/4 inch groove cut in it. What this does, it's a couple things. You can see that there's junk all over it. This holds pickup bobbins for me when I'm putting screws in. It holds, you saw it earlier, holding a Telecaster plate as I was soldering stuff. I might actually drill a couple holes maybe in the back side of it, so I flip it over and maybe I could put a pot in here that would hold it correctly, which would be pretty cool. And then another trick that I've shown people in the past is when you're doing an output jack, because that's a lot of times one of the things you'll solder, is you can just put a screwdriver through it like so, and that'll hold it from rolling around on you. Having your work still and held is probably the most useful tip I could give you. Good heat. Do not cheap out on an iron. Don't use one of those big guns either, because that'll kill guitar magnets, because that's a big transformer coil in there. So just use a regular soldering iron, but use a good quality one. The 15-watt ones from Radio Shack, those cheap ones, will not be effective for doing guitar stuff over a period of time. Keep it clean, keep it hot, good solder, and keep your work still. That's pretty much the gist of it. So there you go. I hope that helps. I hope it kind of clears up some things. I know a lot of myths fly around on the internet, but I can tell you from doing this every day for years and years. I mean, I've been soldering almost daily for probably 25 years. So, it's not that hard. Those fundamentals are the most important thing, and stay away from those myths, because they'll further complicate things and in some cases make your job harder now and or later. Anyway, thanks for hanging out. Thanks to all my Patreon supporters that support the channel, everybody who uses super chats and super thanks on the live streams and the super thanks afterwards in these videos. You can check out our soldering course if you want. It's in the description. I'll leave a link to it. It gets much further in depth with each component on how to do that. And then, of course, we sell all of the components that you see here and I'll have links to everything in the description, etc. So thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you in the next video.